Welcome. We're glad that you're here to talk about wealth inequality in America. I know that I'm a new face to most of you in this room. That's because yesterday I started as the executive director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs. Thank you for that. It's a real honor to join the Colby community. I moved from Washington, D.C., so it's an adjustment for me. But I'm excited to be here tonight to introduce this topic and our speaker. I will first shamelessly plug my own lecture because I'm not faculty, so I won't be lecturing a lot. But I will be speaking next Wednesday night here at 7 p.m. on connections between climate change and food insecurity. So if that interests you, that's my area of expertise. Please come to join us for that. But tonight, we are talking about wealth inequality, which is an incredibly relevant topic today because it's Super Tuesday. The wealth gap and the disparity between the rich and poor in this country is rightfully so at the top of our political discourse and a prominent part of the 2020 presidential campaign. I probably don't need to tell you, and the reason we probably have such a good turnout is because the country's wealth gap is at an all-time high and certainly has lasting intergenerational consequences. Many of you, especially students, are probably aware of the April 16th Goldfarb Center Freedom of Expression Symposium. I think Andrew handed out some handouts. You want to lift those up? If you didn't get one and you're a student, grab one from Andrew now or later. As you might be aware, or you'll see on the handout, students can create policy briefs to compete to win up to $2,000. If you want to know more, talk to us or others. Don't talk to me yet, I know nothing. But talk to our staff or look on our website to learn more information. But really, we're here to listen and learn from the great expert professor, Christel Kesler, who's going to help unpack this topic for us. She's going to help us understand why inequality happens, what it looks like, what's the role of social policy, and why it should matter to you. So I have the honor of introducing and telling you a bit more about Christel Kesler. She is an Associate Professor of Sociology. We can give a whoop, that's great. Yeah. She joined Colby faculty in 2017 after teaching at Barnard College for 6 years. She holds an MA and a PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley. Before that, she earned her BA from University of Wisconsin in Madison. She's a highly respected quantitative sociologist. A lot of her work has focused on the relationships between migration and inequality, and particularly looking at ways in which those relationships are shaped by social policy. She has published 11 peer-reviewed articles in eminent journals, and most recently she published a study that she collaborated with Colby student Avery Munns in Social Science Research, which is a peer-reviewed journal, and their study explored maternal employment patterns. So they looked at variations by race, ethnicity, and nativity, and how those patterns impact preschool enrollment. And also, as Carrie mentioned, I don't know if you heard her, but Professor Kesler recently received tenure, so please join me, and congratulations for that. Professor, over to you.
Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. I hope that we have a productive conversation on this topic. It's obviously a jam-packed evening for those of us interested in policy and politics. And I understand that the fun continues after this event with another Goldfarb-sponsored event to watch the election returns. So I won't keep you longer than the promised amount of time tonight, so you can go do that afterwards. I'm going to try tonight to give you a sort of primer on what I think are some of the most important patterns and trends in wealth inequality. Students always, with these kinds of questions, explanation and policy recommendations are always much more challenging than description, and so I'm going to touch on a few of the explanations and policy implications here and there. I'm going to leave some of that to our discussion after the talk and to the students who plan to develop policy proposals on this topic for the Freedom of Expression Symposium that Kimberly was talking about. So I'm not the first one to suggest that one way to think about wealth inequality is with the metaphor of an escalator. This is fairly common in the literature on this topic. Even more importantly, an escalator alongside a stationary staircase, which is why I like this photo. What I hope to show you over the course of my presentation is that if we think about many of the things we hope for, work for, strive for in our lives, whether that's engaging educational opportunities that we have here, fulfilling employment, stable and rewarding family lives, safe and comfortable homes, opportunities for our children, any of these things, whatever it is that we might imagine lies at the top of this picture in our own lives, wealth inequality in our country means that reaching those heights is faster and easier for some of us than for others. Some of you in the audience may know this because I have some of you, my students and so on, have taken already a deep dive into studying wealth inequality, and for you, some of the things I present tonight are going to be old news, but given the range of starting points in the audience, I'm going to begin with some very basic definitions that will help us kind of understand this phenomenon. So the first and most fundamental thing to understand about wealth is that it's different than income. And I can't tell you how many times, when I first start talking to students or anybody actually about this, that there's this kind of conflation of income and wealth in people's minds, when in fact, they're really quite distinct, and some of those distinctions are incredibly important for understanding the implications of these inequalities. So when we think about income, the first thing we usually think about in terms of income is that it's defined as money that flows into our pocketbooks or our bank accounts over a given period of time, like a pay period or a year. Yeah. The first thing we think about then, if we're thinking about where does this income come from, is income from work and from employment. When we think of income from our work, we also need to think not just about the official amount that an employer might pay you in wages or a salary, that's usually the first thing we think about, but also about those so-called fringe benefits that are hugely important to accumulating wealth, and that are even more unequally distributed than wages and salaries. These are things like employer-sponsored health insurance, employer contributions to 401k or 403b retirement accounts, which are also tax advantaged, that's important. So there's a sort of, what some people have called a sort of hidden hand of government woven throughout lots of the patterns I'll show you. That's the kind of tax advantaged nature of some of these kinds of policies. Besides employment, other major considerations related to income in a given time period are returns on existing wealth, which is what's sometimes called passive income. That's, how much does someone earn from various investments? And this is not just financial wealth, but also housing or real estate, which is the most important form of wealth for most American families. And then the last thing I'll just mention, as I'm very, very briefly giving the kind of definition of these things, is government subsidies. So we can think here about social benefits, like something like a social security check, but we can also think about the ways that certain kinds of spending or saving are subsidized through our tax code. These are called, from the perspective of the government, tax expenditures on what are for households tax breaks. And they're a huge deal. And they disproportionately benefit households that already have high levels of income. An example of this is the way in which private retirement savings, which I just mentioned, these kind of 401k, 403b type accounts, or private healthcare spending, or spending on mortgage interest are encouraged through tax breaks. Those are just a few of the largest examples of these kinds of tax expenditures. So wealth is measured at a single point in time, as in how much you have at the time that a certain survey is being fielded, but it's accumulated over an unbounded period of time. Wealth is what happens when you take the income that you don't spend, let's say this year, and you add that to the income you didn't spend last year, and to the income you didn't spend the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that, and the generation before that, and maybe another generation before that, and you add it all together. And because of this cumulative nature of wealth, it's always more unequal than income. In order for it not to be more unequal than income, we'd have to start wealth accumulation from zero on a really regular basis, which of course we never do. And it's really hard to ever imagine that we would do that on a regular basis. So for our purposes here, wealth is always more unequal than income. Because of the way wealth is accumulated, one way to think about wealth is that it holds history. And this is, I have to give a nod here to a student who took my inequality and social policy class last spring, who came up with this phrase, wealth holds history, and kept repeating it all semester, and I thought it was really awesome. The idea is that wealth holds history in a very concrete, material, tangible way. So all the inequalities of the past that may have gone into generating income, this year, last year, the year before that, these inequalities of the past live on in the wealth inequalities of today. So I'm going to turn now to a sort of overview of some of the major patterns in wealth inequality. And I'm going to start, if it works here, yes, with this animation from the Urban Institute. This slide is from them. That kind of allows you, as I talk here, to look at wealth inequality growing over the last 50 years in the United States. All of the dollar figures here are adjusted for inflation. So these are 2016 dollars, the latest year in the series. And one way of thinking about how high wealth inequality is, one way of measuring it, is to line every household up from the least wealth to the most wealth, and then see how much higher certain cut points in this distribution are than others. So in this figure, the cut points we're looking at are these various percentiles of the distribution, so the 10th, the 50th, and so on. And so I'm just going to point out a couple things here. One is that at the 10th percentile here, there's not a lot of change over 50 years, right? This hovers around 0, even a little bit negative, over the course of these years. So no change. The median, or the 50th percentile, right, that's the typical family. The typical family's wealth has changed more than at the bottom. So from just under $50,000 50 years ago to just under $100,000 now. So it's essentially doubled. It was actually a little higher than that before the Great Recession, but it's essentially doubled over the course of 50 years. So, from some perspective, not too bad, right? But the big picture clearly here is what's happening at the top end of the distribution. And I'll just focus on the very top, which is the 99th percentile. So that's the top 1%, that we keep hearing about in political debates about this topic. So that increased, so the amount of money that someone in the 99th percentile had increased from about $1.5 million in the mid-1960s. So that's not nothing. And remember, that's in today's dollars, so that's like $1.5 million in today's dollars. So it increased from that to about $10.5 million today. And this is for 2016. That's the most recent. There's the kind of definitive survey data on wealth is called the Survey of Consumer Finances. They field it every 3 years, and the most recent data that most of these analyses incorporate is 2016. We'll have another year here pretty soon with the 2019 data. So if you're anywhere in this picture that's not at the top, and you're trying to, let's say, compete with people up there for any kind of opportunity, if you're climbing the staircase while folks up there are on this escalator, there's just no possible way you're going to feel like you're keeping up over the last 50 years, right? This gap is between a kind of a typical family and any of these places further up on the distribution has just widened dramatically. People often wonder about how much of this wealth is inherited wealth, right? Because we have these questions about, the kind of, I would say, legitimacy of the wealth. I think that's where these questions about inheritance often come from. And it turns out that that's actually a somewhat tricky thing to actually estimate. The actual value of gifts and inheritances overall in this picture is only, according to some estimates, around 15%. So if you had a gift, let's say, of $20,000 from your parents 10 years ago, and that allowed you to put a down payment on a house, and you just update that $20,000 for inflation, the share of gifts, if you measure it like that, gifts and inheritances, is only about 15% of all wealth, which might seem really low. But other people have said, no, we actually need to add to that amount the returns on the original wealth. So the fact that those investments allowed you to accumulate more wealth. And it turns out if you do that, the share of direct gifts and inheritances, is, along with returns on them, is more like half of all wealth. So that's maybe a little bit more in line with what people might guess. So this is one way to kind of measure wealth inequality. Another way is to, oops, I'm gonna just, there we go. Another way to look at wealth inequality is what share of total wealth some group in the distribution has. So for instance, the 1% share, right, the 1% that we keep hearing about, is how much of all wealth in this country is held by the top 1% of the population if we line them all up. And this graph here comes from the work of Saez and Zuckman, who are familiar to any economists in the room, and it shows the top 1/10 of 1% share. So this is if you divided the whole population into 1,000 pieces. This is how much does that top 1,000th have. And what you can see here clearly in this picture is what we call the Great U-turn over the course of the 20th century, which is this kind of dramatic decline in the first half of the 20th century toward the mid-century, due to, most commentators attribute this to both the destruction of the world wars, of capital, and the kinds of social policies that were in place in the post-war period. So that's, you know, this downturn in the earlier part of the century. And then we see, since the late 1970s, early 1980s, this uptick in inequality. And we see this kind of uptick whether we look at, you know, this 0.1% share, the 1% share, slightly larger share of the top. We see this with all different measures of wealth inequality. But this just gives you some idea of this very important U-shaped trend in inequality over the course of the 20th century. I'm always someone who likes to have a cross-nationally comparative picture too. So this next slide gives you a little bit of a sense of that for a handful of wealthy democracies. Here I'm switching to the top 10% share, right? So it's going to be a bigger amount, so that I have comparable figures. These are just the ones that were more comparable across the countries. So what you can see here is this current level of wealth inequality in the U.S. is high, not only compared to our own past, but also compared to other countries. What I find interesting about wealth is that the kind of ranking of countries we see here is actually a little bit different than what we would see if we looked at income inequality, and that's because countries have different sets of policies that don't always perfectly correlate in terms of how they deal with these two forms of inequality, how they tax things and so on. So for instance, Denmark surprised me that that's actually higher. You know, this is a kind of social democratic society that has very progressive policies regarding income equality, and yet we see it kind of here near the top. The point kind of is that wealth is actually very unequally distributed everywhere. I mean, none of these figures suggest like that there's some utopian, very equal paradise with respect to wealth inequality. It's a very high level of wealth inequality that we see across all of these countries. One final way of measuring wealth inequality that I'll just mention in case people come across it in reading about these things is a metric called the Gini Coefficient, which is named after an Italian statistician. And I'm not going to get into any of the technical details of how it's calculated, but it ranges from 0% to 100%, where 0% means no inequality. Everybody has exactly the same. Wealth is perfectly equally distributed, and 100% means one person has everything. And the Gini coefficient for wealth in the United States today is about 85%. So that's like the distance between perfect equality and total inequality. We're at about 85 on a scale of 0 to 100. So now I'm going to turn to some ways of thinking about not just the overall level of wealth inequality, but questions about who has what in this distribution. And I'm going to focus on two sets of categories here, important sets of categories, namely race and gender, that play a very important role in shaping wealth. I'm going to start. You've probably seen some flyers, political ads to this effect around Maine, especially about a year ago, related to a law that Governor Mills signed intended to promote equal pay between men and women. I won't get into the details of that law, but the 82 cents figure that was on those kind of flyers that were circulating around Maine in the last year or so, that's been floating around. I think it's actually pretty familiar to people. I actually get students reciting 80 cents on the dollar to me kind of all the time in papers and memos and so on. And the figure is relatively similar for the US as a whole, around 80 cents to the dollar. The idea is that for every dollar a full-time male worker earns, a full-time female worker earns 82 cents, somewhere around in there. And that figure, as I said, is pretty similar in Maine and at the national level. Interestingly, young men and women have actually really similar earnings. So this pattern here emerges when people start to become parents and are making decisions about the domestic division of unpaid caregiving labor primarily. So the 80 cents figure is pretty accurate, but it reflects lots of different things and not just kind of equal pay for the exact same work. I think sometimes it gets framed in those terms, and that's not what this figure represents. But I want to use this 80 cents figure as a comparison, a point of comparison for a series of other things I'm going to show you next, right? Because this, I think, is one that's pretty familiar. People kind of, a lot of you, know this kind of 80 cents on the dollar figure already. The first thing I want to show you from here, I think, will come as a surprise to no one, and that's that there are earnings gaps in the United States, not only by gender, but also by race, and by the intersection of gender and race. So this just gives you some idea of that. So I purposely set this up so that the orange bars represent the percentage of white men's earnings that the given group earns, right? So this is the 82% is like the 82 cents on the dollar. And we see equivalent figures lower for black men, 73 cents on the dollar, Latinx men, 72 cents on the dollar, black women, 65 cents on the dollar, and Latinx women, 62 cents on the dollar. So this just gives you a sense of those inequalities in earnings, right? This is among full-time workers. So these are all folks who are working full-time, and these are the differences that we see. Okay. But now remember what I told you before about how any inequalities that exist in income are magnified over and over again when we think about how wealth is accumulated over time and across generations. So here's a look at the gender gap in wealth. And I'll note here that thinking about the gender gap in wealth requires that we address questions about how married spouses share their wealth. There are some different ways of getting around that question. One way of getting around it is to compare single men and single women to each other, which is what I'm doing here. And I'll just say that is actually about half of all adults at any given point in time. So we're not living in, Leave It to Beaver 1950s fantasy land where everybody's married. There are about as many single adults as there are married adults at any given point in time. Some of those singles were married or will be married at some point in their lives. But at any given point in time, it's only about half. So among the singles, women have about 36 cents for every dollar in wealth that men have. This is those accumulated inequalities over time. Sociologist Marika Chang, who has studied the topic of the gender wealth gap extensively in her book called Shortchanged, which I would recommend if this is something that you're interested in. She suggests that the two biggest factors are different work histories, so we saw a little bit of that with the earnings inequalities, but also importantly, including the fringe benefits that I mentioned much earlier in the talk, so that those are also even more unequal than wages and salaries between men and women. And then the second factor she mentions to help explain this is the still disproportionate amount of single parenting that single women do, which makes it various ways much more difficult to accumulate wealth. So those two things together explain a lot of this gap. One reason we can't point to here is inheritance. One important thing about gender, about men and women, is that they come from the same families. There are no discernible differences in the likelihood of men or women getting gifts or inheritances from their parents, and that's a big deal for thinking about why the gender wealth gap isn't bigger than it is. So this looks big compared to the earnings gaps, but it looks tiny compared to the next thing I'm going to show you. So here's the kicker, the racial wealth gap, which is the topic of the symposium, right, that a lot of you are going to be thinking about policy proposals to address. So I assume actually quite a few of you, and I know some of you from my classes, already know quite a lot about this, and that's why you're here tonight. But here's, just let's revisit the magnitude of the racial wealth gap and think about it and let it sink in. So for every dollar of wealth that a white household has, a black family has about 2 cents, and a Latinx family has about 4 cents for every dollar. Yeah, this is like an incredible gap. It's much different in magnitude than any of the others that we've looked at. So this is the ultimate illustration, I would say, of the idea that wealth holds history. That's recent history, that's more distant history. In terms of recent history, this includes a history of labor market exclusion and discrimination that leads to lower rates of employment in the first place and lower earnings when people do work, like what we saw a few slides ago. Experimental audit studies, where they send out kind of paired resumes, that kind of thing, have shown, there was an interesting meta-analysis a couple of years ago. That means combining all these audit studies where they sent out resumes to look at patterns over time. In this case, that meta-analysis showed that there was no change in levels of racial discrimination in hiring and in the low-wage jobs, sort of entry-level jobs over the last 25 years. No, there's a significant level of racial discrimination, and there's been no change in it over the last 25 years. We can add to that a history of mass incarceration that affects fully a third of Black men and their families, their spouses, their partners, their children, and makes it extremely challenging to accumulate any wealth, not only during the period of incarceration, but in well-documented patterns of discrimination based on a criminal record after people are released from incarceration. So there's discrimination in the housing market, both the well-documented subtle steering that occurs now and the legally sanctioned history of exclusion from the most important wealth-building policies of the federal government in the post-war period, namely federally subsidized loans that allowed many white families to purchase homes for the first time in these decades after World War II. Redlining, I feel like most of my students have had this in one class or another. Carrie, I know that's like a whole class on this, which is the practice of excluding Black families from eligibility for federally subsidized loans was perfectly legal until 1968. That's just a couple of years before my parents, for instance, were buying their first home, so this is not very long ago. So this is like the descriptive part of the talk, the what wealth inequality looks like, is my title. And I'm going to spend just the last handful of minutes here turning to the why it matters part. I'll leave this up here for you to just reflect on as I give you some of my thoughts on this. So I alluded to the idea at the beginning of the talk with the picture of the escalator, but I want to think about the idea of opportunity broadly conceived. So injustices of the past are an important reason to care about today's very high levels of wealth inequality. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his very influential article in the Atlantic Monthly in 2014, made a case for reparations. That was the title of the article. He defines reparations as, quote, the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. And I'd love for us to think about and discuss, and for some of the students who plan to participate in the symposium this spring, to think about how full acceptance of our collective biography, which is fairly vague, might translate into concrete social policies that target the racial wealth gap. But I'd also like to make another case for thinking about why we should care about the racial wealth gap. So even in a hypothetical utopian world where we believed that all of the wealth people have accumulated was in ways that we 100% condone of, and obviously we're very far from that world, but imagine that for just a minute. I would like to challenge us to think about the idea that the extremes in wealth inequality that we see today undermine anything resembling equal opportunity for the next generation, and I don't think that's a very big leap. So one very compelling recent study by sociologists Sasha Killewald and Fabienne Pfeffer showed that as important as inheritance and gifts are, that is like direct transfers of wealth, for thinking about how wealth inequalities are reproduced across generations, that actually the most important ways that parents use their wealth to advantage their children happen in much less direct ways than literally handing down that wealth. In fact, show that even if we got rid of inheritance altogether, if at a person's death, their wealth was simply gone. There would still actually be an extremely strong correlation between the wealth that parents have and the wealth that children eventually accumulate themselves. And I'm just going to read one sentence from the very end of this article to kind of illustrate this point. So they write, by the time large, direct, intergenerational wealth transfers occur, such as in the form of bequests, which is a more general term for inheritance, the beneficial effects of wealth have long been established and already materialized in the offspring's own wealth attainment. These transfers, these direct gifts, are merely the cherry on top. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind for anybody who's thinking about kind of what direction to go with some of these policies. Not that inheritance and intervening in inheritance in certain ways wouldn't be hugely influential and hugely important, but that it would not get rid of the correlation across generations in wealth. So in other words, let's think, however parents got their wealth, so this in the scenario where we're thinking like it was all completely legitimate and we condone it entirely, they're likely to use their wealth in a wide variety of ways to benefit their own children. So think here about educational opportunities and advantages, time, especially time without financial stress, exposing children to amazing, enriching experiences and so on, right? You can think of lots of examples of these kind of things. So does the fact that wealthy parents can give their own kids these kinds of experiences mean that parents aren't sometimes also at the same time doing things to benefit other people's children? No. But fine for me, this is my challenge, for me, a parent that doesn't in many important ways, some almost subconsciously, use the resources at their disposal to benefit their own children more than other children. Changing the wealth distribution in various ways that we can talk about might be challenging, but I think that convincing parents to not use the resources at their disposal to benefit their own children is arguably even more challenging. Children don't choose their parents, right? They're subject to a lottery of birth. So the question of where wealth comes from and how legitimately it was earned is very important. But it's not the only important question. We should also think and ask questions about how wealth in one generation unequally benefits the next generation, regardless of where the wealth came from. And at what point is our concern about a more equal starting line for the next generation reason enough for redistributive social policy? And I'll just end, since it's election night, with one final argument for why wealth inequality matters. The economist Thomas Piketty, most of you probably who read in this area at all are familiar with his important book called Capital in the 21st Century. One of his arguments in that book is that capitalism of the kind we see today automatically generates arbitrary and unsustainable inequalities that radically undermine the meritocratic values, that's the part I was just talking about, on which democratic societies are based. So at stake at the end of the day, he's saying, is democracy. And I think I'll end there because I want to have enough time to talk about some of these things and find out what you all would like to talk about more. I'll send you off to watch the election returns in a bit, but I'll take questions at this point about any of this or any of the many related topics that I wasn't able to cover in this short amount of time. So I will. Just ask me to talk about something I didn't talk about too. It doesn't have to be a probing critique of anything I said. There's lots of stuff related to this I didn't talk about.
How that reflected or brought into the study? Like how do they quantify that in terms of wages?
The question there is not really, there are probably some effects on wages, but it has more to do with single parents' abilities to save money that they earn. And the demands for consumption of various kinds are higher for single parents than people would say without a child in residence with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's not to say I actually don't know the answer to whether there are documented actual earnings gaps that single parents face, but it's, I was thinking more on the consumption end of things. Cheryl had a question, I think, next.
If you could fiddle with the inheritance laws, what would you do?
Well, I'm going to point out one thing, which is that largely unnoticed over the last 20 years, inheritance laws have changed dramatically. We talked about this in my class, right? So people think that inheritance is mostly taxed. It's mostly not taxed at all. The current threshold, I think the threshold changed again this year, is something like $11.5 million. That is, if your inheritance is smaller than that, it's not taxed at all. In the early 2000s was I'm going to forget the exact figures, but it was something like 1, 2, 3, 4 million was the threshold for taxing estates at all. And it's a very tiny number of estates that are above that threshold, right? So I think lowering that again to some extent is not, there's precedent for it. It wasn't that long ago we had a threshold that was different than that. And I would be fully in favor of doing so. I think that my warning about, that that's not going to do everything is still, that's not the only point at which parents use their wealth to benefit their children, right? It's not only when they die. That's, as these authors that we were quoting said, that's the cherry on the top in a lot of families. But it doesn't mean it wouldn't go some distance in ameliorating the inequalities.
As an aside, I think the inheritance tax was actually for estate tax.
Estate tax, yeah.
Estate tax was actually eliminated in 2011.
Yeah, it's been a little bit all over the place for the last 20 years, but that didn't last very long, and I'm not sure that elimination actually was ever implemented. I feel like it was like a kind of a back and forth vote on it or something like that. I'm not gonna.
As we all know, and this is too late for today's voting at this point, but Elizabeth Warren's been talking about 2%. I think it was George Will who recently made mention of, I think it's an Oregon senator who has proposed an income tax on appreciations of non-income. Non-W-2 income. Passive income. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about that.
You mean on capital gains?
Well, it wouldn't be capital gains. It would be just increases in income in your stock portfolio. The value of your stock portfolio would be treated on an annual basis as income to be before it's actually declared or
sold or
what's the word for that? Before it actually shows up on
Taxable
declared income or taxable income or whatever. I can't remember exactly what the income word is. But that's, have you heard of that? And what is your thoughts about that?
I don't know if I've heard of that. It's always, I think, important to point out that we have one important form of wealth tax already, and that's property taxes. But interestingly, wealth that's not property, that is more liquid wealth, financial wealth, is actually more unequally distributed than property. We don't tax it in this way. And it's in some ways easier to, that one of the problems with property taxes, and this was the kind of famous turn against property taxes in California in the 1970s, is that people don't always have liquid funds to pay the property taxes, right, if their property values increase a lot. So in some ways it's kind of strange that that's the form of wealth that we tax on a regular basis, and the other form we don't tax at all.
That's exactly what they're trying to get at. Is we have this liquidity that's not being taxed.
Yeah, exactly. So actually the Warren proposals grew largely out of some suggestions of this economist I mentioned at the end, Thomas Piketty. The idea of a wealth tax like that is, something he's been talking about a lot. She very much, has read that and talked. I don't know if she's talked to him directly, but she's very much aware of the kinds of proposals that are being developed in the scholarly world surrounding a potential wealth tax. There's a lot of controversy about whether that's the best way to do it. Wealth is slippery. It's hard. There's a lot of kind of just logistical concerns about how one would would tax some forms of wealth, but that doesn't mean that one can't try, right?
Recognizing that the title is Wealth Inequality in America, I'm still curious your thoughts of more how this relates to global trends, meaning, is the huge change that we're seeing in that 1% happening everywhere? Is there one country that sort of does this right, or just any sort of global trends comparing America to other places as you look at this topic?
I would say that, like, among the advanced democracies that I'm more familiar with, that it's a matter of degrees, not kind. I mean, you saw in that comparative graph that I had, right, that these top wealth shares are quite high in lots of countries, including some that have considerably more equal income distribution than we do. And so, I do think some of the, a lot of the pressure on wealth inequality comes from income. I mean, it comes on what's happening, not only, that's the point I was trying to make in the talk, but it's not only, but that's a big part of it. I mean, there's a reason I mentioned that first. And there's, the great U-turn that we see that in income. And we see that in a lot of different countries, although with income, we definitely see that there are some countries that through policy manage to kind of prevent that uptick that we saw since the 1970s. Like, there are countries, Japan, France, that have managed to kind of like counter the forces that I think are to some extent global that have been increasing income inequality. So they do more through taxes and so on to keep the income inequality lower. But as far as I know, the uptick in wealth inequality, that's fairly universal, just not as extreme as in the US. There's definitely something going on. It's not just like we're this isolated country and it's unrelated to anything else happening for us.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about this earlier in terms of like housing policy and stuff, and so I just want to hear you more talk about like how the GI Bill and those sort of things really allowed men to take certain role and how that looks gender-wise, because I found that really interesting.
Well, so this is the part I didn't really talk about too much, right? I showed you the comparison of single men and single women. And the question is, how do you deal with the half of the population that is married at whatever given point in time you're actually looking at wealth? And so one assumption that people often make is that that married couples share their wealth equally. There's lots of reasons we might think that's not the case. And Mariko Chang, the same book that I mentioned earlier, the one called Short Change, does, in addition to some really nice data analysis of these trends, does some in-depth interviews with how married couples actually, control the wealth that they may sort of vote jointly on paper or not, right? And finds that in married couples, men also have more control over the financial assets, which then in turn determines, when a marriage dissolves, which also happens in about 50% of cases. You can imagine that there are like inequalities that then flow out of that differential control over those assets during marriage. So the GI Bill, you mean the education part of it or the housing part of it, or both?
Both.
Yeah. I mean, education is interesting. Like when I said, when I made the point that inheritance doesn't matter much for gender inequalities in wealth, education doesn't matter much anymore either. I mean, women have surpassed men in educational attainment. So it's not educational attainment per se that explains any of this. There are some questions of what kind of things do women study when they sort of field of study segregation and occupational segregation in the labor market. That are important things to think about, but it's not education per se. I don't know if that was true in the immediate post-war decades when men were benefiting from GI Bill. I would imagine there was still differences in education between men and women. But anyway, today I don't think the education part is at all part of the gender story.
So to help that balance the wealth, how do you think the U.S. government should spend money to help the, say, like the black households accumulate more wealth? Should they help with affordable housing, free medical and health care, or free education? Which one of those three do you think the money would go further?
All of the above. I mean, free education to some extent, we have, we have free education in the K through 12 level. There's differences in quality that are incredibly important. There are, arguably even more important, or at least as important, are the ways that the quality of school affects kind of patterns of where people want to live and where they purchase their houses and what happens to the values of those houses in very desirable neighborhoods. So that, I imagine that not only just like the education per se, but if there was something that made it so that neighborhoods were not so differently desirable in terms of their schools, that might play out in certain ways in the housing market too. But I mean, all of the above. I think all of the above. So whoever's going to work on these proposals for the symposium has lots of different directions they could think about. Yeah, no thing by itself is going to like close this gap. Totally, right? This is like matters of degree, like I said before, but anything that affects these differences in earnings, differences in ability to save because of medicals being met in some way that I'm not paying for it out of pocket. Any of these things, you can think again about that this year, last year, the year before that, like accumulating over time and having some effect on this gap.
We have time for another question.
Just look through my notes and see what else I think you should be asking about.
Question. Do you have any sense of how the demise of the pension and the rise of the 401k, 403b has impacted wealth?
I can't give you like a figure, but I'll just mention a couple things that are important to think about there. So I've talked about this in my class with some of my students, but for those of them who aren't familiar with this, there's been an incredible shift since 1970s, I think the movement started, from what are called defined benefit pensions, where you kind of like Social Security, but private ones, where you pay in and then have certain pension rights for all your retirement years, no matter how long you live. Yeah, and those are pretty much completely gone for people my age. My parents still have one, I think, and they've been privatized in the sense that you have defined contributions instead. So you're paying in certain amounts. Sometimes your employer is matching that in various ways, and it's all tax advantaged. But the big thing I would say there that is interesting to me is the ways in which that shift put the onus on the individual to understand investment in a way that wasn't necessary before. Right? So these are individual accounts. People need some savvy to know how to invest them in ways that are going to benefit them the most.
So it goes back to education.
Right, on that particular kind of thing. I mean, I don't know if that's something you learn, right? I don't know if that's something you learn in formal education. Unless I don't know, if any of you had a class that you feel like teaches you that stuff? Yeah, a little bit?
Business degree.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like a lot of people don't really know this, and that those skills are probably very unequally distributed. I mean, I don't know enough. I don't know anything actually about what that actually looks like, but putting the onus on individuals and their families to make those decisions about investment seems to me to probably increase the inequalities that are going to result from that as a pension system.
And I don't know how relevant this is, but you mentioned reparations, and what that brings to mind is actually some of the conversations that are happening in Maine today with respect to our tribes, and who I think were definitely set back from our history and how we treated them. And I guess because they're sovereign nations, at least in other parts of the country, and I know our tribes in Maine are trying to, as I understand it, trying to become more equal with sovereignty aspects in other parts of the country. I'm just curious, when you talk about the term reparations, what are you thinking about?
I mean, it's interesting that that's kind of the ultimate of these examples of, a land grab, like stealing, and the resulting, consequences of that for wealth today. I think, I genuinely don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know what exact, I think there's probably lots of possibilities for the direction of policy that would go some distance toward, as Coates said, like a full reckoning with our collective biography, right? Which would include that. But I think, like, in some ways there's first the, like, thinking about that as a motivation, and then there's kind of like the policy leads, and I still struggle, honestly, to connect those things sometimes myself, to think about what that would look like. I think there's lots of policies that would kind of do that, but which ones are better and which ones are less good, I don't have a really strong sense of right now, to be honest.
One more question?
Sam had her hand up. I don't know. We can do one more question.
If you'll take one more.
We'll take one more.
So my question is about what you ended your talk with in terms of parents always having the natural inclination to invest in their own children, even if we're investing in other children too, or own the most. There's a scholar at Brookings, I think, who's written a book about hoarding of opportunities.
Yes,
with the same.
Yeah, I know that book very well, yeah.
So what sorts of policies resonate with you as effective policies around hoarding of opportunities?
I actually am not convinced that that's an easy thing to do at all. And that's part of the reason why, even though I think some people think about redistributive social policy as, oh, that's very complicated, I actually think that's the easier way to go. I think it's harder, I think it's easier to redistribute wealth, as hard as that might be, than to kind of like convince parents that they're not going to use the resources that they have to most benefit their own children. I think that's harder. So we can, think about that, but I actually think, I don't know, like that is the hardest, I think. That's like the hardest, that's at the core of this whole thing, is that that's happening all the time. And so I actually think the redistributive part is easier, as hard as it might be. That's not I don't know if that's a satisfying answer to you, but
Actually, it's satisfying. I think I'm there with you.
Yeah. And to just make it so that this family doesn't have this much more than this family, but this much more, right? That will make a difference. I really think so.
Thank you so much. I won't bring up the very heavy but beautiful flowers that we have to give you, but we will give you some awesome Goldfarb Center swag in either Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks. Starbucks, yeah, choose one. There you go. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much for your